Now on to the definition of science, part 2. Hey, calm down. Recall, a good definition of science applies to all and only the fields and activities which are scientific, as we discussed in the last lecture. And a good definition of science includes both a descriptive and a normative component. So in part 2, we're going to look at various candidate definitions of science, which have been proposed by philosophers, which have been considered in court cases throughout history, and including recent history, and kind of assess, whether or not these apply to all and only scientific fields and activities, and if they have that descriptive and normative component. So let's start with one of the oldest definitions of science, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle's definition. The fancy term is apodictic certainty. So this definition contains two components, and these will make sense once we explain them. The first component is that scientists have know why knowledge, rather than merely know how or knowing that knowledge. And the second component is that scientific reasoning derives from various certain infallible principles, like mathematical principles or physical laws. So let's look at each component in turn, starting with component 1. So what's the difference between knowledge that and knowledge why? Well, your local weird hermit may know that a certain plant is deadly, okay? But the biologist knows why that plant is deadly. They'll know the chemical composition of the toxins in the plant and what they interact with in the human body that causes you to, get severely ill or die. Farmers know that a storm is approaching when the sky is green. Meteorologists know why. They can explain the various physics behind that. Boat builders know how to build something that floats. Engineers know why it floats, for example, the principles of buoyancy. Engineers also know why some structures do not float. So those, just to recall, then that's that first component. Scientists have know why knowledge rather than merely know how or knowledge that knowledge. And this is one of the components of Aristotle's definition of science. And this seems pretty plausible in many cases. Again, biologists know why certain types of infectious agents, various bacteria and viruses, are deadly for you, rather than merely that it's harmful for you. They know why certain drugs work. They know why, certain types of industrial processes lead to environmental damage. That someone that lives near the place where the environmental damage has occurred will know that there's been damage caused, but they don't know why precisely. So that seems plausible. Let's look at component 2 then. Scientific reasoning derives from various infallible principles, mathematical principles, physical laws. For those of you who are physics students or engineering students, or perhaps economics students, you've dealt with a lot of this already. Scientists, for example, can predict the behavior of comets from Isaac Newton's laws, or the time dilation effects of spacecraft from Einstein's laws. And satellite scientists have to apply Einstein's equations, especially for GPS satellites, just to ensure that they're accurate. If you're an engineering student designing like a roller coaster or whatever, you're applying a lot of Newton's laws. In fact, most engineering students, they're literally learning every single application of Newton's first law, or one of Newton's first laws, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, in all sorts of different contexts. So you're taking this kind of immutable certain law and then applying it. Well, there's been challenges to Aristotle's definition. Let's look at, again, reason 1 is that scientists have know why knowledge rather than merely know how or knowledge that knowledge. There's been challenges to that. So, challenges to 1. Newton was actually able to explain gravitational phenomena with his equations, but he didn't know why his equations worked. So we know that two bodies are attracted to each other as a function of both how heavy they are, their mass, and then also their distance. The closer they are or the heavier they are, the more attraction there is. The further they are apart or the lighter they are, the less attraction there is. Newton was able to develop a mathematics that could make all sorts of stunningly accurate predictions about the behavior of bodies based on gravitational attraction, even though he had no clue how gravity worked. At the time, in the 17th century, they thought it was kind of spooky, actually. Gravity was this thing that acted at a distance. It was almost like telekinesis. Two things were exerting forces on each other, even though they weren't actually touching each other. So at that time, they had no idea how gravity worked. In fact, a lot of people rejected Newton's theory of gravity because he couldn't explain how it worked. But nowadays, we accept a lot of it. For a long time, they accepted it. And it's definitely considered a scientific account of gravity. But the problem is Newton's account of gravity does not explain why gravity, his equations work. It just shows that they work. So Newton's account of gravity would not satisfy Aristotle's definition of science, even though Newton's account of gravity is properly considered a scientific account. Now we know through Einstein's general theory of relativity, we have a better understanding of how gravity works. And there's also been challenges to the second condition. Here, recall, this scientific reasoning derives from certain infallible principles. Well, the problem is most scientific explanations are considered fallible, tentative, revisable, merely approximate. They're open to revision. If there's new evidence, they'll change, So 2 is not a necessary condition either. It does not describe what is actually regarded as scientific. So I've got a picture here of one of the earliest models of the atom. This was Thomson's model of the atom. Thomson did not know about protons and neutrons, so he just thought that atoms were these kind of like globs of positive charge with electrons that are negatively charged embedded in them. Kind of like, think of the positive charge as like, well, a cloud, or actually more commonly described, a way of more describing it is like pudding, like positively charged pudding with negatively charged electrons embedded in it. So this is one of the earliest models of the atom, which is definitely, and there was empirical evidence for it, but it's been revised. Now we have much more sophisticated, up-to-date models of the atom. All right, so let's look at candidate 2, verification, and there's going to be 2 versions of this. Candidate 2A, we'll look at first. A statement is scientific if and only if it could be exhaustively verified by a sensory experience. So here's an example. Take the statement, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Well, if you could exhaustively verify that water always freezes when the temperature is 32 F or below, then that's a scientific statement. But the problem is this word exhausted. What does that mean? Well, what it means points to the problem with it. The definition is too narrow. To exhaustively verify that statement, you would have to observe every single instance of water reaching 32 degrees Fahrenheit or below to verify that water freezes when it's 32 degrees F or below. That's what it means to exhaustively verify it. You observe every single instance. And in fact, not just every single instance, every single possible instance of water. So this is too narrow. There are many statements that have not been exhaustively verified, but we consider them to be scientific. So this definition is too narrow. It's too exclusive, okay? It includes things that are perhaps, it only includes statements that we would consider scientific, but it doesn't include all statements that we would consider to be scientific. All right, well, let's look at a slightly different version. This is version 2B. A statement is scientific if and only if it could be verified by a sensory experience. So we've dropped that word exhaustively verified in it. And now we just have verified. So this revised definition has a very obvious advantage. It doesn't require statements to be exhaustively verified to be scientific. So this is already an improvement. 2B is better than 2A. So take the statement, a duckling is wearing a hat. This would be verified by a sensory experience of a duckling wearing a hat. There's some problems with 2B though. While 2A was too narrow, 2B is too broad. The reason is many pseudoscientific statements are verifiable. For example, the earth is flat. You could check and see if the earth is flat. Turns out it's not. So, but there's a sensory experience that could verify whether or not that statement is true. On a more serious note, many historical statements are verifiable. For example, true historical statements are verifiable. For example, Abraham wrote a letter to Mary Todd in 1859. Well, if you found a letter to Mary Todd from Lincoln dated 1859, you would have verified that. But that's not a scientific statement. That's a historical statement. So to be is too broad. It's too inclusive. It includes perhaps all scientific statements, although we'll look at, although there's challenges to that as well, because there are scientific statements that actually don't, there are components of scientific statements that don't rely on sensory experiences. We'll look at that soon. But things like electrons and quarks. So it's too broad though. It includes things that aren't science. All right, well, let's look at a different definition. Falsificationism. A statement is scientific if and only if the statement can be falsified by an observation. What do I mean by falsified? Well, let's just take a falsifiable statement. Goose honks always precede goose mating. Okay? So if I were to find a goose honk that did not precede goose mating, but rather say goose fighting, then I would have falsified the statement, goose honks always precede goose mating. By the way, here's some fun trivia for you. Did you know that geese have teeth? They do. Here they are. Look at that. Yes, geese have teeth. You do not want a goose to bite you. It will hurt. You'll probably have to get on antibiotics too. Okay, but enough about that. So this is a falsifiable statement, and it's false. Goose honks don't always precede mating, but it's considered scientific on the falsificationist account. So let's elaborate a little bit more. To understand falsificationism, one way is just understand the motives for it. You can never exhaustively confirm or prove empirical statements that are general claims. For example, you could not exhaustively confirm that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or below, because you would have to observe every single instance when water froze, and that's literally not humanly or perhaps physically possible. You could not exhaustively confirm that ducks say quack or that swans are white, because you'd have to see every single swan or every single duck, every single, okay? But you can falsify or disconfirm a general claim. All that it takes to falsify a general claim is one instance where that claim is false. So if you find one instance where water does not freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then you've falsified that claim. If you find, for example, a black swan, then you falsified the general claim that all swans are white. All it takes to falsify the claim that all swans are white is a one non-white swan. You could have 10 billion white swans and one black swan, and then you have falsified the claim that all swans are white. So according to this definition of science, and scientific statements are falsifiable. Like, you could find some sort of sensory experience that would disconfirm that statement, that would falsify it. So they're open to being challenged. And that's, and in many cases, what scientists are doing in the lab is they're trying to find evidence that challenges their hypotheses. They're not looking for evidence that necessarily confirms their hypothesis. Instead, they're looking for evidence that would disconfirm it, that would falsify it. And the stuff that they hold on to, the theories that they hold on to, are the ones that have been tested a bunch of times but have not been falsified yet. So in some senses, this does somewhat accurately describe what a lot of scientists are doing some of the time. And also why some theories are still around, why some theories are successful, is because they've been tested and have not been falsified yet. But the reason they're scientific is because it could be falsified. You could run an experiment where you find evidence that disconfirms it. So this is what prima facie distinguishes falsificationism. Falsificationism, that is what prima facie, at first glance, distinguishes scientific theories from pseudo-scientific theories. This was Karl Popper's example. Take a man who pushes his child into a river to murder the child. It's a bad father. Take a different man who sacrifices his life to save a drowning child. All right. Well, Freudians claimed that the first man was repressed, and that's why he was trying to murder his child, whereas the second man was achieving sublimation, which is why he would risk his own life to save a drowning child. But according to Karl Popper, Freudians' use of concepts like sublimation and repression and unconscious desires made their theories with any clinical data made their theories consistent with any clinical data, and such they could never be challenged by such data. Like, it didn't matter what you saw at the clinic when you had patients on the couch, talking about their dreams or whatever. Every single thing you heard was consistent with Freud's theories. So Freud's theories weren't falsifiable. So a lot of scientists and a lot of philosophers of science, they didn't think very highly of Freud. It seemed like he was doing voodoo or kind of new agey stuff. Of course, now we know that some of his stuff he actually got quite right. There are subconscious beliefs that influence our behavior. We'll be studying that this semester when we look at various types of cognitive biases. But I mean, there was it just seemed, but in a lot of cases, though, Freud, just like his theory could account for everything. There was nothing that could possibly challenge it. Well, in that case, it's not really, according to Karl Popper and other falsificationists, theorists of science, that his theory wasn't scientific. Also, Popper did not like pool parties. So, interesting thing about falsificationism, this is also a definition of science that has been considered in court cases. A very famous court case in the 1980s, when I think the Arkansas Board of Education or one of their local one in Arkansas, they wanted to teach creationism in public schools. And they tapped the philosopher of science Michael Ruse to testify, and they were in a trial about this. And Michael Ruse famously argued that creationism is not science and therefore should not be taught in public schools because creationism is not falsifiable, whereas science is falsifiable. And I guess evolutionary science is falsifiable. Therefore, that is science. Creationism is not. So this is a definition of science that has been used in important court decisions impacting education policy. According to philosophers like Karl Popper as well, falsificationism explains some of the most important episodes in the history of science. So Einstein, came up with the general theory of relativity, which was an account of gravitation. Basically, gravitational attraction between objects is explained by the fact that objects with mass warp space-time. So he kind of explained something that Newton was not able to explain. And this was successful. So his general theory of relativity made a very definite prediction that light rays from distant stars are deflected by the sun's gravitational field. And this is possible to observe in a solar eclipse. And Sir Eddington did that in 1919. He observed the solar eclipse, and he showed that the deflection was by exactly the amount that Einstein predicted. So this, in some sense, it confirmed it, but this is how it connects to falsificationism. Had the observation not matched the prediction, it would have shown that Einstein was wrong. So Einstein's general theory of relativity is falsifiable. There are possible sensory experiences, possible observations, possible types of empirical evidence that would have shown that it's false. So his theory, Einstein's general theory of relativity, could have been falsified. It was open to falsificationism, unlike Sigmund Freud's various theories of behavior. Now, Einstein's theory was not falsified. Of course, if it had been, there would have been no general theory of relativity, and there would have been no movies about relativity, like Interstellar. However, and get used to this in this lecture, there are quite a few problems with falsificationism. Even though this is probably the theory that's, again, this has been the one that's been used to define science in famous court cases. In fact, if you ask many scientists today, most of them would describe science as being, they would probably, give some sort of falsificationist definition of science. And just anecdotally, when I've talked to scientists, that's usually how they describe, what separates science from non-science and what scientists are doing on a day-to-day basis. But again, there's some problems with falsificationism. First problem is it's just too broad of a theory. Many pseudoscientific statements are falsifiable and have been falsified. For example, the Earth is flat. So on this definition of science, flat earthism is science, when it is not. Also, many non-scientific that, for example, historical statements are falsifiable. Abraham Lincoln was a Jedi Knight. That's false. That's a historical statement, not a scientific statement. So again, falsificationism turns out to be too broad. It perhaps accounts for all science, but not only science. It's too inclusive. There are things that aren't science that get counted as science on the falsificationist definition of science. Another problem with falsificationism is that it's just too vague. So you can get contradictory observations that can be explained by a problem with the lab setup or with what's called an auxiliary hypothesis. And I'm going to explain this in more depth. But individual scientific hypotheses, individual scientific propositions are rarely tested in isolation from other propositions or theories. Okay, I'm going to explain that in this lecture, and then we will probably get an entire lecture talking about this on the problem of underdetermination of theories, and then some other stuff. But I want to give an abstract explanation of this, and then we'll look at a concrete example. So take a hypothesis H, which predicts P of some sort of observation. So you test the hypothesis, but you don't actually get the observation P. So here's the logical structure. You have the hypothesis, and you think that hypothesis will give you this observation. But when you test the hypothesis, you don't actually get this observation. So you would conclude that the hypothesis is false. I predict that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I put some water in the freezer. The water doesn't freeze. So I conclude that water does not freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. But the problem is, hypotheses are never tested in isolation, or maybe rarely tested in isolation. Instead, hypotheses are tested in conjunction with a whole lot of other background beliefs and auxiliary assumptions. And these background beliefs and auxiliary assumptions include various theoretical beliefs and beliefs about the experimental setup. So here's the real structure when you're testing a hypothesis. It's the hypothesis, and you're predicting that the hypothesis and a whole bunch of other beliefs being true will give you this observation. So then when you don't get the observation you're looking for, it's this whole thing that is false. But the problem is you don't know whether it's a hypothesis that's false or various background beliefs. It may be that the hypothesis is true, but some other thing is false. So let's look at a concrete example. So here's a concrete example of this point I'm making, which until now has been kind of abstract. Here's a hypothesis. The COVID-19 vaccine is effective. Well, then if the COVID-19 vaccine is effective, then someone who gets the COVID-19 vaccine won't get infected. So the hypothesis is COVID-19 vaccine is effective, and that predicts this particular observation, the observation that you give someone the COVID-19 vaccine and they don't get infected. Well, supposing I give someone the COVID-19 vaccine, but they get infected. Well, in that case, the predicted observation turns out to be false. Here's the deal, though. Should I reject the hypothesis or one of these background assumptions? We also assume that when we give the COVID-19 vaccine to someone, that they're going to have a functioning immune system. They're not immunocompromised or immunosuppressed. We expect that when they're exposed, they're going to be exposed to the normal variant of COVID-19. And we also suppose that the vaccine has not expired. So if you give the COVID-19 vaccine to someone, but they still get infected, what do you reject? Do you reject the hypothesis that the vaccine is effective, or do you reject one of these background assumptions? Maybe you gave it to someone who was compromised, or they were exposed to a mutant version of COVID-19, or maybe you gave them an expired vaccine dose. So again, it's not obvious what is falsified when you falsify something. What should be falsified when you test up a hypothesis is not always obvious. Of course, this is not to say that falsificationism has not played an important role in the advancement of science and in explaining scientific progress. It's just again, it's not always obvious what is falsified when prediction turns out to be false. Another issue is that falsifiability itself comes in degrees. Some scientific claims are very general. Other scientific claims are very specific. Here's a fairly specific claim. Matter is composed of electrons and quarks. Here's a more general claim. Matter is composed of particles. Well, claim 1 is more specific than claim 2, and it's easier to falsify more specific claims. Hence, falsifiability comes in degrees. In fact, it is the more general the claim, the less obvious it is just what would falsify it. So the more specific the claim, like helium consists of 2 protons and 2 electrons, and hence it's stable, the more specific a claim it is, the more obvious it is what would falsify it, whereas the more general it is, the less obvious it is what would falsify it. Again, compare the more general claim that infections are caused by germs to the more particular claim that HIV causes AIDS. This is easier to falsify than this. All right. Again, it's harder to falsify more general claims. But many general claims are properly considered to be scientific claims, like E equals mc squared, one of the most famous scientific claims. So falsifiability just struggles to account for this. Another issue with falsificationism is, in fact, it's actually too narrow. So it's at the same time too broad and too narrow. There are examples in the history of science where it was foolish to give up a theory even though there was a contradictory observation. Here's a recent example. CERN researchers a few years ago allegedly found faster than light particles. If so, the special theory of relativity claims that there is nothing in this universe that is faster than light. And again, we've made use of this theory for a lot of stuff. So should we suddenly give up the special theory of relativity's signature claim that nothing is faster than light because the CERN researchers may have found something that's faster than light? Well, they didn't. In fact, they dug harder and found reasons to see that these particles actually weren't faster than light after all. So here's an example then where falsificationism doesn't actually explain an actual scientific success. It doesn't actually describe progress that's been made in science. Scientists didn't give up the postulate that nothing's faster than light. Instead, even though they allegedly falsified it, and that's what they ought to have done on falsificationism. Instead, they held on to that view and found other reasons. Another example so at one point, we didn't know about the planet Neptune. We hadn't discovered it yet in the solar system. So the observed orbit of Uranus conflicted with what Newton's theory predicted at the time. So Uranus had an orbit that was inconsistent, allegedly, with Newton's theory. So if scientists abided by the falsification requirement, they would have just gave up Newton's theory. But they didn't give up Newton's theory. Instead, they predicted maybe there's an unknown planet that's causing changes in Uranus's orbit with a certain mass and a certain position. So it turns out they were right. They discovered the planet Neptune, and it vindicated this prediction. So the postulation of Neptune prior to what would have been considered an ad hoc the postulation of Neptune prior to its discovery would have been considered ad hoc, simply to save Newton's theory, but it's considered scientific. And scientists do this all the time. So falsificationism doesn't capture actual scientific successes or practice. Scientists regularly don't give up stuff just because they find something that conflicts with their predictions. They make revisions. And sometimes this leads to new discoveries. If these scientists had faithfully stuck to falsificationism, we may not have discovered Neptune. Okay. Pop quiz, which planet is Uranus and which planet is Neptune? Neptune's blue, so this picture does not help. But one of these is Uranus and one of these is Neptune. Well, you can Google search yourself because I forget myself. Okie dokie. We've looked at 3 different candidate definitions of science and have found problems with all of them. Maybe the 4th one will be the charm. So here's candidate 4. Something is scientific when it's testable against empirical observations. So something is scientific then if and only if it appeals to observational data to judge whether it is true or reasonable to believe. Here are some problems with this, though. Often 2 scientific theories, which are competing theories, are empirically equivalent. There are a lot of times where 2 different scientific theories have the exact same observational data and appeal to the same observational data. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this lecture, and then I have a whole lecture on the relationship between theory and observation that we'll be looking at. So I won't spend too much time on this. But so, for example, suppose that this was temperature data. All right. So these are temperature recordings from like perhaps a weather station in the ocean. Well, we assume then that perhaps the temperatures progress in a linear fashion like this. But this data, these plot points right here, are consistent with the temperature fluctuating like that. So anytime scientists then have empirically equivalent theories, even though they have observational data can't decide between them. Instead, the scientists have to appeal to something else to pick two competitor theories. Something that, aside from the observational consequences, like, well, my theory is simpler or has more internal clarity than your theory, so it's better. The thing is, though, the two theories aren't tested then against observations. They're judged by appeal to philosophical considerations instead. So oftentimes what scientists appeal to when they're deciding between two different theories that have the exact same observational data is philosophical considerations. So again, this is also where philosophy of science comes in. There's also just problems with distinguishing between theoretical claims and observational claims. There's no such thing as theory-independent observation. It's either impossible or perhaps it's just incredibly rare. And again, I have a whole lecture on this, but we'll talk about this for a few minutes. So scientific theories deal with unobservable entities and processes all the time, like quarks. No one's ever seen a quark. Or electromagnetic fields. Can't see that either. You don't observe that. So these entities are tested indirectly against things that are observable, like the behavior of magnets or the iron filaments. So there's an ineliminable component of the meaning of these terms that is not empirical in content, in which case the total content of the meaning of these terms is not exhausted by empirical content. There's a non-observational or non-empirical or non-sensory component to the meanings of these scientific terms. Here's another thing. So observation itself, anytime you're looking at something, your observation is theory-related. So we have to distinguish seeing as, I guess you could say, and ordinary seeing. Or perhaps actually all seeing is seeing as in some sense. What do I mean by that? So when a nuclear physicist sees the sun, they see the sun as resulting from nuclear fusion. They've been trained in this. They know what's going on when hydrogen atoms smack together and form helium, and releasing all sorts of energy in a kind of a chain reaction. When, on the other hand, most children, most scientific laypersons, and people who lived before the 1900s, when they see the sun, they see just a big bright ball in the sky. They don't know anything about nuclear fusion. Don't stare at the sun, though. It's a bad idea. So we don't passively receive sensory input. Observation involves interpretation. So candidate 4, then, is too broad. Oh, another problem with candidate 4 is it's too broad. Again, history appeals to observation. I observed this, I found a letter written by Abraham Lincoln to Mary Todd that I found in the Lincoln Library in the attic. So I've got new evidence for my historical theory about Abraham Lincoln. So that's not a scientific pursuit, but it's, still appealing to observations. So this, I think, is going to be the last definition we look at because it's another one that's been discussed. And it's relevant to some current events. This is reproducibility or repeatability. Something is scientific if it is reproducible or repeatable. There's been something in the news called the replication crisis in social psychology and the medical sciences because a number of important findings have not been replicated. So this kind of assumes that replication or repeatability is a part of the definition of science, a part of the essence or nature of science. Well, let's take a look at this. And there are two different senses of repeatable or reproducible, so we should look at two different definitions. Here's the first sense. Sense 1. Scientific claims are about repeatable events. Here's an example. Bodies always attract each other according to Newton's laws. No, I'm not talking about romantic attraction. There, physical attraction, like Earth and the moon are attracted to each other by Newton's laws. Explains that. Other examples: water freezes at the same temperature, carbon decays at the same rate, plants grow in sunlight, etc. So this is in which, scientific claims are about repeatable events. Well, is this a good definition of science? No, it's not, because scientists also study many singular events, like the Big Bang happened once, the Cambrian explosion in biology when a bunch of life forms appear in the fossil record, that happened once. The extinction of the dinosaurs happened once. But if you're studying the extinction of the dinosaurs, you're doing science. So sense one is too narrow, okay? It doesn't capture all science. There's a different sense two. Something is scientific, it's repeatable, I guess you can say, in an epistemological test. What do I mean by that? Basically, you find some sort of experimental result, and someone else could duplicate what you did, like in a lab or in the field, and get similar results. Your results are publicly checkable. So like if you use this equipment, this quantity of this chemical, you'll get a similar observation. This sense two is probably necessary for something to be scientific. Your work should be transparent. Other people should be able to get similar results if they do the same thing you did. If I claim that a lake has been poisoned, someone else should be able to go take samples from that lake and find the poison, for example. But many other non-scientific fields are repeatable in this sense. A historian could be transparent about the text they've translated, the artifacts they inspected, to justify their particular explanation of a historical event, which others can then use. So sense two is perhaps necessary, but it's too broad still. It doesn't capture only science, even if it perhaps captures all science. So here's the deal. We've looked at 5 candidate definitions for science. We've found them all to either be too narrow or too broad, or not describe what scientists do, or not include the normative component. I could probably go through this exercise with numerous other definitions of science. We could look through your old high school science textbooks where they define science in the introduction, and probably find many similar problems with this. So is this a problem? Maybe it's not a problem that we can't offer a precise philosophical definition of science. So here's an ancient philosophical question. At what length does peach fuzz become a mustache? Here's a picture of me when I was 27. Okay, there is no precise answer to this ancient philosophical question. However, it does not follow that just because we don't know the precise length at which facial hair changes from peach fuzz to a mustache, that we can't recognize a non-mustache, peach fuzz, and a genuine mustache. This also applies to stubble, beards, and neck beards. It also applies to science. It does not follow that just because we can't know the precise definition of science, that we can't recognize genuine cases of science versus non-science. Chemistry is definitely science. Alchemy is definitely not science. So don't despair yet. There's definitely borderline cases, but there's also clear-cut cases. Additionally, there are signs for spotting bad science. For example, bad motives. Scientists paid by the tobacco industry who cherry-picked their research findings so they could find stuff that didn't connect smoking to cancer. Well, they were acting on bad motives. They had an incentive to find evidence that smoking didn't cause cancer. And they were getting paid by the tobacco industry to do that. So if there are bad motives, that's a sign of bad science. Sometimes scientists if someone uses an inappropriate method for a particular topic or question, that's a sign of bad science. For example, a survey is an inappropriate method to find out the genome of a virus. Instead, you would want to do some sort of genomic analysis in the laboratory. Likewise, stool samples from college students are an inappropriate methodology to find out college students' attitudes towards online teaching. In that case, a survey would probably be more appropriate. Fraud is a sign of bad science. If a scientist is hiding results or fabricating results, that's bad science. that's a sign of bad science. So that's it for today. That's all, folks.